The assassination of their beloved Primus, Hollings York, cut deeply at the hearts of countless ComStar adepts and acolytes across the Inner Sphere. More than that, news of his death was sad tidings for many others outside of the Sacred Order. He was the first Primus to enjoy widespread popular approval among all walks of life. When Andrea Martin had died in a road accident at the turn of the century, the successor lords from the Capellan Confederation, Freewells League, and Lyran Commonwealth all attended her funeral. Hollings York brought the heads of all 5 of the great houses to Earth for the first time since the Star League High Council was disbanded at the onset of the Succession Wars. Even his former opponent, Hugai Kurita, was in attendance. The Primus was buried beneath the chapel at his beloved Sandhurst Military Academy. Adrian Sims had inherited control of the Hyperpulse network and sought to exploit this unprecedented support. A week of mourning was declared, and Hollings was canonized into the ComStar Order, the 3rd former leader to be proclaimed a saint after Blake and Toyama. The fact that privately York was viewed by many among the First Circuit as one of the greatest threats to the survival of their institution, and that their intelligence agency ROM was most likely the one who orchestrated his assassination, needn't impact the way the Primus acted publicly. During Adrian's conferences with the successor lords, she again stressed ComStar's commitment to neutrality, and offered her organization's help in arbitrating any issues between the great houses that might help bring the eternal conflict to an end. They, of course, thanked Sims for her benevolence, then promptly departed Terra without any such talks taking place, as she no doubt fully anticipated. Meanwhile, Presenter Rom Gilbert was slowly dying in a hospital bed. His ultimate fate is unknown, but it's doubtful that the Primus felt threatened by his potential survival. While he lay in a coma, she stripped him of his position and gave the title instead to her brother, Carl Sims. Half a century earlier, a similar act among the Kirsten family had proved the ignition point for the ComStar Civil War, but it's indicative of how firmly the First Circuit were behind their Primus that no objections were raised to this familial favoritism. The first decade of Adrian's rule was relatively uneventful, as she set about strengthening her position and repairing the damage done to Rom by her predecessor. The ComStar guards and militia continued to train and grow in the background, but they received far less attention under Sims's watch than before. The status quo was shattered unexpectedly in 2959, when the Primus came before the First Circuit with alarming news. The previous night, Adrian had awoken from her dream to find the ghostly apparition of Jerome Blake himself standing beside her. Their sacred founder had warned her that a new threat to the survival of mankind had grown in secret beyond the borders of the Inner Sphere. This shocking revelation was met with a great deal of skepticism among the First Circuit. Concerned about her health, they mandated that she attend Rampton Clinic to receive professional psychological counseling. The celebrated Presenta Dieron Stephanie Hendricks would serve as Primus Protem during her absence. Sims accepted their commandments in good grace. The senior presenters of ComStar exercised their control over the Order through the enforcement of numerous religious rites and ceremonies in all aspects of their daily operations. Even the simplest of tasks could not be undertaken without the appropriate observances and a prayer of thanks to the machines and technology that made interstellar communications possible. Despite this, it remains unclear just how strongly the upper echelons believe in these rituals. Adrian Sims returned from her 6-month leave with an even more distressing admission. The best doctors had concluded that she was not suffering from any psychological disorders, and though she had dutifully followed their stress relief program, her hallucinations had only intensified in her isolation. The previous night, St. Conrad Toyama had come to her in a dream and pointed to a map of the stars. As she watched, strange monsters emerged from the surrounding darkness to engulf the Inner Sphere in flames. Their leader's insistence that she had experienced a true vision was a step too far for the First Circuit. They decided to leak word of her perceived mental instability to the wider organization as they prepared to remove the Primus from office. Their plan backfired spectacularly. The more pious underlings were enraptured by Adrian's clairvoyance, wholly believing that she had indeed communicated with the Blessed Blake and his disciple Toyama. When Sims came before the presenters again in November 2959, she called for the creation of a new branch of ComStar to be known as the Explorer Service. These volunteers would embark on a grand voyage into the Periphery in search of the threat she believed was lurking out there. Ever the pragmatist, she did not cite any mysticism in her proposal, fully recognizing that there were few among the First Circuit who believed her. Instead, she drew attention to the fact that the ultimate fate of the Star League Defense Force remained unknown. The unexplained appearance of the Minnesota tribe at the onset of the Second Succession War was proof that they had not all perished. Above all, the Explorer Service would endeavor to find the descendants of the legendary Alexander Kerensky. Her opponents could hardly refuse the wishes of a woman who was now perceived as a prophet. In December, presenter Sergei Gavalov was appointed director of the Explorer Service. He gathered together other members of the Order, particularly seeking strong believers in the cause among ROM and the ComStar guards and militia. Ironically, the new mission drew many of the Order's more secular members to it, whose beliefs didn't quite mesh with the faithful around them. Similarly, any ROM agents who knew too much often found themselves volunteered for deep space exploration. The director had broader ambitions for the new undertaking than simply hunting for the Exodus fleet. His task force would search for any pockets of humanity that existed out in the deep periphery and recover any useful technology they stumbled across. To assist in this endeavor, the new Magellan-class jumpship was launched in 2960, a vessel designed for extended voyages into the unknown. Likewise, the Fastlane-class yardships received a new lease of life within the Explorer Service. On February 24, 2961, CSV Providence jumped out from Land's End, leaving the safety of the Inner Sphere behind and heading out into the darkness. When First Prince Peter Davion inherited the throne of New Avalon from his father, the future of the Federated Sons was looking bright. The armed forces were routinely outperforming their enemies on the field, and the troublesome MechWarrior brotherhoods had been largely dismantled. Peter had already proven himself a capable leader, so should have been able to maintain that momentum to reach new heights. Instead, he faced a far more insidious threat than his predecessor could have imagined. Paul Davion's reformations had given the First Prince greater authority within national government than ever before, but on a local planetary level, the minor nobility gained several devolved powers. Those knights first ennobled by the ruling family may have owed them everything, but their sons and daughters had inherited their lands without exhibiting any of that same gratitude towards Peter. In recent times, they had become increasingly obstructive in their behavior. Davion attempted to pass further reforms that would bypass the authority of the problematic nobles, but their coordinated efforts stymied his progress. They spoke openly of defying his commands if he tried to remove any one of them. The heart of the problem was that the AFFS had become increasingly reliant on them to fill in the gaps in their military. Davion couldn't risk losing their battle mechs if they went AWOL, especially with the Capellan border once again hotting up in 2960. If he couldn't undermine their power, he could perhaps counterbalance it with another elite group. Though Peter was himself a MechWarrior, he developed an infatuation with aerospace pilots over his 3 decades in power, whom he poetically referred to as his Knights of the Void. He heaped lavish praise on the aerospace arm of the armed forces and increased their budget to enhance their equipment and training, a decision that paid off handsomely when Ingrid Liao led her armada to Li back in 2952. The issue was that continuing on this path threatened to create the exact same set of circumstances and inter-service rivalry that nearly led to ruin back during the First Succession War. Davion's favoritism angered the prideful MechWarriors within his realm, and in the years that followed Li, they consolidated their strength by forming the Warriors Cabal. As the First Prince began to purge his realm of the obstinate nobles, it drove many others into the Cabal's camp. Things came to a head in 2961. Colonel Geoffrey Dempsey won a great victory for the Federated Sons in recovering Breed, a world lost to the Dragon in the opening moves of the First Succession War. Peter Davion wished to visit the planet so he could supervise the recovery effort, but his ulterior motive for travelling there was to remove the colonel and two of his quarrelsome subordinates from command. Geoffrey had been publicly outspoken about the First Prince's reforms. He was a leading figure within the Warrior Cabal who had rallied many within the Draconis March to their side. Dempsey had even gone so far as to make threats against the Successor Lord's life should he continue to undermine the prestige of his fellow MechWarrior nobles. Not taking the danger seriously, Peter Davion's entourage pulled up outside the colonel's headquarters on May 25th. At that moment, 5 battle mechs hidden within the surrounding forest powered up and opened fire on his limousine, killing the First Prince instantly. The rogue officer was taken into custody, but the teeming mobs on Breed besieged the compound, demanding their liberator's freedom. 5 whole regiments refused to swear fealty to Peter's son Andrew, instead taking up arms against him. The new First Prince wasted no time in seeking retribution, taking the entire Davion brigade of guards with him, accompanied by a sizable force of fanatically loyal aerospace pilots. Andrew descended on the renegade forces before they had time to organize. A swift campaign of extermination culminated in the destruction of the last of the Robinson borderers on Deshla that December 8th. The Federated Sons was spared from any serious fallout that the mutiny within the Draconis March might have caused because of the strong sense of malaise that had taken hold of the Combine across the border. The idle coordinator Hugai Kurita had allowed the military arm of the Dragon to atrophy in the last decade of his life. His refusal to participate in government left the DCMS scrounging for whatever parts they could find, working off outdated budgets from years earlier. This period of lethargy finally came to an end when he passed away in 2963, but by then Andrew Davion had solidified his position. Coordinator Hohiro Kurita promised to dig the Draconis Combine out of the hole it found itself in when he assumed power later that year. He had grand ambitions for both military and social reform, with a drive to see them implemented. These changes were dubbed Dragon Renewals. In an unfortunate irony, his ideas were draconian in nature. To rebuild the shattered DCMS, Hohiro siphoned off funds from the People's Medical Services, a move which unleashed a plague that killed millions. Similar reductions in aid and relief budgets exacerbated the issue, but Kurita was convinced that hardship would make his people stronger. He even went so far as to shut down hospices run by charities and other organizations, but there he came up against opposition from ComStar. A gentle reminder from the Primus about the fate that had befallen his father Hugai was enough to dissuade him from any further action. The coordinator risked making a new enemy, or rather an old one, when he impulsively scrapped all existing trade deals with the Outworlds Alliance, drafting new ones that would prove ruinous for the Periphery realm. For daring to reject his proposals, Hohiro had their ambassador executed and warned that an invasion would follow. It took a visit from President Ronaine Avalar herself to smooth over the diplomatic snafu. Upon her arrival at Luthien, she gifted Kurita a quantity of rare radioactives with military applications, informing him that our frontier colonists had recently uncovered a motherlode within the abandoned Outworld's wastes. While Ronaine could not hope to stop the Draconis Combine if they should attack her realm, she could order those radioactives shipped to the Federated Suns in exchange for aid. Recognizing the threat, the Coordinator agreed to more favorable terms, unaware that Avalar had bluffed about the existence of said stockpiles. Across the Inner Sphere, the Freewells League was experiencing another sudden and unexpected handover from one Captain General to another. Thaddeus Marik II's unexemplary rule came to a premature end in 2963 when he drowned swimming off the coast of his family estate on Conakry. The Atrian throne passed to his son. Stefan Marik spent the early part of his reign assessing the performance of the FWLM. The Capellan front was holding up well enough, with a minor raid launched against Bryant achieving its objectives, after which they handily dispatched a counterattack on Holt in 2967. The Lyran front was less promising. The assault on Dixie was an embarrassing failure that convinced the Captain General that he needed to focus his efforts there. Any plans Stefan made would have to take account of the fact that many of his border provinces continued to invoke the Home Defence Act in Parliament, as they had every year since the disastrous Operation Killing Stroke. This left him precious few troops to conduct an invasion with, unless he turned to political horse trading, which he was loath to do. While Marik drew up plans, a number of factious regions within the Terran corner of the realm were enacting their own legislation. To better look out for their own interests, the duchies of Amity, Calasan, Danae, Kalidasa, and Shiloh came together in 2966 to form a new power bloc, the Silverhawks Coalition. Approaching the 100-year anniversary of the Third Succession War's commencement, the borders had become largely static. Weapons of mass destruction had been unofficially outlawed, warships were practically extinct, leaving only conventional forces to get the job done. A century of warfare following on from another 80 years of Armageddon had left the Great Houses nothing with which to make any significant gains. Doubtless some maniacal figures yearned for the days when they could unleash annihilation on a world with the press of a button, then plant a flag among the ashes to claim a victory. As such, work to develop ever more virulent biological compounds continued in secret. Though such weapons were no longer being used on the battlefield, they still managed to be responsible for the single deadliest event to take place during the Third Succession War. On the planet Tall Trees, a secret research base on the island of New Tierra del Fuego II suffered a terrible breach of containment. The facility had ostensibly been working on agriculture research, but the plague that escaped quarantine soon infected the whole island. The exact death toll isn't known, but it numbers in the tens of millions. This was certainly the most challenging trial Chancellor Ingrid Liao had to face in 2966, but not the only one. The armed forces of the Federated Suns again resumed their raids along the border, most notably at Axton. A far larger task force attacked Spiker in 2970. 3 mercenary regiments made landfall, only repulsed by the combined might of 2 of the elite Capellan Hussar units. In a rimward direction, the defenders at Xianquang were massacred to the last man. The Confederation blamed House Davion for the crime, but were unsure whether or not the attack had actually been carried out by pirates. The CCAF was focusing its attention against the Freewells League, with a raid on the Marik family estate on Lopez back in 2965, then another at Hazefeld 5 years later. The latter ended in defeat, the invaders completely overrun by multiple regiments of the Marik militia. Liao would not order anything more than the most minor of raids for the better part of a decade after this, focusing instead on maintaining order at home. A mercenary rebellion on Moravian caused some minor trouble, but there was growing unrest among the population on other worlds too. Whether the Free Worlds League's infamous liberation units were behind these incidents is unclear. Hohiro Kurita may have exhibited poor statecraft since taking power, but perhaps at least the increased funding he had allocated for the DCMS gave them a chance at recovering their former glory. A minor raid on Lyon in 2966 hoped to unbalance the relentless Operation Freedom, but their main focus was along the Davion border. Here they faced off against two of the Federated Sun's premier mercenary units. First, the 12th Star Guard in 2967, and then Makaran's armoured cavalry 3 years later. Though the damage inflicted during these raids was minimal, it did succeed in unexpected ways. Both mercenary groups were critical of the Davion officers under whom they served, and so left the employ of the Federated Sons soon after. The former made their way to the Lyran Commonwealth, where in 2970 they were utilised in a raid against Leblon. The latter abandoned Davion for Liao, where they still remain today. In April of 2973, Draconis Combine mercenaries ventured out to hit Kesai 4, a world taken from the Dragon some years prior. The long-planned invasion of Loric, Captain General Stefan Marik's prospective masterstroke, commenced in 2971. It was to be the largest battle the Free Worlds League military had yet engaged in during the Third Succession War. 15 regiments were committed to the battle, with the core of that strength being 2 regiments of the Regulan Hussars. As an interior province, the Principality of Regulus could not invoke the Home Defense Act under the same pretense as the border regions, and so were obligated to lend their troops to the campaign, despite the general animosity that existed between House Cameron Jones and the ruling family. Supporting them were a regiment of the Marik militia, 11 conventional units, and another mercenary group. Garrisoning the Lyran border worlds were 10 mixed regiments of armour and infantry, but crucially no battle mechs. Unsurprisingly, the FWLM was able to quickly secure every objective they had on the planet, but the stubborn defenders proved a constant thorn in their side. Their resistance brought enough time for Steiner to dispatch reinforcements to the world. Elite mercenaries from the Iridani Light Horse and 12th Star Guard touched down in December, beginning a 4-month battle that inflicted brutal casualties on the invaders. As reports from the front came in, Regulus took to the floor in Parliament to claim that the Captain General's refusal to call for a retreat was putting their principality at risk, and thus they too wished to invoke the Home Defense Act. Their fellow anti-Marik MPs assented. Stefan's hand had been forced, but the withdrawal from Loric was anything but smooth. The Marik militia were ordered to remain on world as a guerrilla force, while the Regulan Hussars had to face a shortage of dropships that forced them to abandon what remained of the 6th Regiment. The survivors from the 3rd were later folded into other units within the brigade. It was 2 years before a rescue mission was finally dispatched to pick up what little was left of the FWLM on Loric. The Free Worlds League had no greater success later that decade. A botched attack against Ford in 2976 was abandoned when they couldn't transfer enough forces to take the planet. Witnessing the downturn in fortunes and facing ever more hurdles in order to receive their promised supply of replacement parts, other notable mercenaries allowed their contracts to expire before departing for greener pastures later that year. The greatest setback for Stefan Marik came in 2978. The year began with a raid on Kursa, then defeat at Wazit after one of the liberation units created earlier in the 30th century turned on the Free Worlds League for cutting off their funding. For the low price of 3 million C-bills, Liao was able to recruit them to their cause. The renegade commander played an instrumental role in helping the Confederation seize control of the world. After so many failures, the Captain General's popularity at court was in the gutter. The Draconis Combine continued to flounder under the arrogant rule of Hohiro Kurita. The successful capture of Quarrel in 2974 convinced the mustered soldiery to have another crack at conquering Tamar. The assault began 2 years later, the third invasion attempt in 6 decades, but again they were driven off when Lyran reinforcements flooded into the system. As ever, the coordinator looked for some external factor to blame for his realm's slow decline. He irrationally concluded that it was because there existed too great a diversity of beliefs and cultures within the Draconis Combine for his people to truly pull together to achieve his goals. In an ill-conceived effort to unify the population, he instituted laws that made all languages bar Japanese illegal. Only mass public demonstrations forced him to roll back that legislation in 2978. Hohiro next set his sights on the internal security force. The Dvarapala Accords have been instrumental in repairing the relationship between the intelligence agency and the Great House, but Kurita felt that it gave them far too much power. He began drafting a revision that he believed would put them in their proper place. When the director caught wind of this, they staged a stunt outside the Imperial Palace. A large depiction of a jite, the favoured weapon of the ISF, was burned into the lawn. The coordinator abandoned his efforts on this front soon after. The reconstruction of damaged factories on Hesperus II was finally complete in 2977. New battle mechs were once again being churned out by the mountain complexes. Giovanni Steiner set up a network of requisitioned merchant freighters to transport them to frontline regiments as quickly as they could. Even though he relinquished control over those vessels the following year, the interruption in normal trade created food shortages on several worlds, with the planet's summit erupting in rebellion. Fighting around the Terran system had intensified in recent years, with the Lyran Commonwealth notably taking control of Safel. Anticipating a counterattack, the LCAF remained on high alert, but they were surprised all the same when it was a raiding party from the Capellan Confederation that struck first in 2978. This marked one of the very rare instances where those two realms would engage in battle, with Steiner coming out on top in this instance. None of ComStar's expeditions had yet succeeded in uncovering the fate of the Star League Defense Force, but they did locate many lost colonies. Some were so isolated that they had remained oblivious to the fall of the Star League, left wondering why contact with the rest of humanity had suddenly ceased 2 centuries ago. ComStar shared most of these discoveries with the successor states, earning greater respect and trust from those quarters, but they censored any reports that mentioned SLDF stockpiles containing lost tech they found. In 2977, director Sergei Galvanov stepped down to make way for presenter Athena Heath to take control of the Explorer Corps, as the division had become known. She would usher in a new era in their history, as the service transitioned from a hunt for lost worlds into more scientific pursuits. 5 years into her directorship, CSV Discovery and Fortitude arrived at the Orion Nebula, where they spent 3 months on station gathering astronomical data. At over 1,600 light-years from Earth, it was the farthest known voyage yet undertaken by mankind. Primus Adrian Sims passed away in her sleep in 2979. She was plagued with visions of destruction up to the end of her life, but no alien threat ever emerged from the darkness of the deep periphery. Having not designated an heir, it fell to the first circuit to nominate Yin Takami as her successor. The new Primus experienced a trial by fire as just 10 days into his term, Presenter Rom Carl Sims approached him with worrying news. Out in the Periphery, a Taurian Concordat exploration team had stumbled upon the abandoned hulk of a Star League Navy warship floating in the new Vandenberg system, SLS Tirpitz. How it had ended up there was a mystery, but presumably it had been deemed too unspaceworthy to embark on the Exodus. Centuries of decay had only worsened its condition, but it still represented a goldmine of invaluable lost tech for House Calderon. ComStar could not allow the Taurian Concordat to salvage the vessel. It was only a matter of time before too many resources were being committed to the recovery for sabotage to be rendered ineffective. Thus, the only option available to Yin Takami was to assign the ComStar Guards and Militia to their first mission. Though the successor states were notionally aware of the Terran Defense Force, its true extent and capabilities remained hidden. To ensure any military action was not traced back to them, the Primus ordered that the 1st Division's ships be painted white, all their markings and insignia removed. The sudden appearance of an unknown hostile force in the midst of their secret salvage operation caught the Taurians completely by surprise. Their own aerospace fighters moved to intercept the attacks, but found themselves facing off against far superior Star League vintage craft. The ComStar forces fully exploited this advantage to win the engagement, then turned their weapons against the derelict. The Black Lion-class battlecruiser crumbled under their concentrated fire, the wreckage knocked into a decaying orbit. As quickly as they had materialized, the raiders vanished, having sustained only 3 casualties. The handful of Taurian survivors gave testimony to what had transpired, spawning the legend of the Vandenberg White Wings, but the Concordat government never released an official statement that exposed what it was they had lost. 1st Division's performance so impressed the Primus that he ordered an expansion of the ComStar Guards and Militia, particularly of their battlemech forces. They would continue to grow in secret back on Terra. Though Yin had succeeded in preventing the spread of advanced technology, his use of the military did not endear him to the rest of the First Circuit, who had opposed the deployment of forces to the Periphery, citing Jerome Blake's wishes never to resort to such actions. Takami was not swayed by their arguments, and adopted a more interventionist stance going forwards. The Capellan Confederation appeared to be living on borrowed time during the final years of Chancellor Ingrid Liao's tenure. The successful conquest of Mira back in 2975 was the last major success they had. Though they held off a Davion incursion at Moravian 2 years later, the cracks in their defense were plain for all to see. Tormax Liao replaced his aunt as Chancellor in 2980. His first year saw the CCAF struggle to repel an attack on New Hessen, while some of their best mercenaries were defeated at Rio, falling victim to the superior Davion fighter pilots. Tormax ordered a renewal of his military's aerospace branch, but this came at the expense of battlemechs, which were already in a miserable state of repair. 2980 was a year of tragedy for the Steiner family. Elizabeth Steiner, the Duchess of Gallery and cousin to the Archon, was assassinated by unknown agents. Then in February, during a demonstration by the Tharkad Equestrian Society before a crowd of 100,000 at Commonwealth Dome, Giovanni Steiner was thrown from his horse and collided headfirst with a wooden fence. He succumbed to his injuries soon after. Curiously, it was the Archon's second child, Alessandro Steiner, that succeeded him. Exactly why his older sister Lisa was passed over isn't known, but perhaps it was because he had already proven himself a competent military commander, and that's what the Commonwealth's ruling elite felt they needed at that moment. The average person was less enthused by his selection, especially when he began his reign with a marked increase in the military budget. Chiefly, this went towards additional supplies and munitions to refill the LCAF's depleted reserves, but the Archon also acquired the services of the Always Faithful. Politically feeble and deeply unpopular with the masses, Captain General Stefan Marik was struggling to keep a lid on the unrest within the Freewells League. The provinces were crying out for better representation, for a return to the old ways of democracy, for a repeal of Resolution 288. To that end, they threw up as many roadblocks in Parliament as they could. By restricting the Captain General's military budget, they could impair his ability to continue the fight, forcing him to make peace, and thus acknowledge an end to the crisis. Stefan believed that if they got their way, civil war would follow. Even during the supposedly idyllic era of the Star League, such armed disputes had rocked the Freewells on more than one occasion. A repeat would surely be exploited by their foreign enemies, regardless of who came out on top. The Captain General may have foreseen the hard times ahead, but he lacked the ability to steer his nation around the danger. When Alessandro Steiner attacked the worlds of Amity, Callison, and Zosma in 2980, it fell to the Border Protectorate and Silverhawks coalition to defend their territory. Marik dragged his feet in dispatching reinforcements, hoping to exploit the situation to remind his cantankerous MPs how much they relied on him to safeguard the realm. Only parliamentary independent Rochelle received limited aid from 2 companies of the Regulan Hussars. His callous strategy did have limited success, as Stefan was able to reform 2 regiments of the Marik militia. The invasion almost dissolved the Silverhawks outright, as the nascent alliance lost control of 2 of its provincial capitals by May 7th. It would take 30 months for the irregulars to mount a counterattack to reclaim Amity. When reports of the disorganized defense made it to the Capellan Confederation, they launched their own raids against Hassan and Vanra, inflicting heavy casualties before they withdrew. Despite their success, House Liao wasn't in a position to do anything more, and so the Capellan border returned to a dormant state. In 2985, the Archon's uncle, Daniel Steiner, was killed in action on Nestor. The war along the Freewells League Lyran Commonwealth border had seen some of the most vicious fighting anywhere during the Succession Wars. The Duke of Duran was only the latest addition to a long list of Great House members who had fallen in battle fighting their hated enemy. While the LCAF continued its tried and tested juggernaut tactics, Alessandro Steiner was planning a more audacious operation. Far from Lyran Commonwealth territory, House Marik was taking advantage of the quiet along the Liao front to construct a new battle mech factory on the planet Ling. Wagering that FWLM forces in that region were on low alert, the Archon believed he could infiltrate the hostile realm and launch a surprise attack. This bold gambit would become known as the Deep Raid, one of the most notable actions of the conflict. 2 Lyran regiments disguised their dropships as civilian vessels and began the long circuitous route through hostile space in 2987. They reached Ling 2 months later. As anticipated, the garrison was so lax in their security measures that they were able to make landfall unchallenged. The operation was so successful that the defenders were easily routed and the precious battle mech factory was razed to the ground. As the successful raiding party departed for their jump ships, their commanding officer made a shocking announcement. Unbeknownst to anyone else in the Lyran High Command, Alessandro had given him secret orders not to return directly home, but to press onwards all the way to Ryerson in the Duchy of Andurian. Then, on the return voyage, they would strike at a sequence of worlds that lay along their route. The units assigned to the Deep Raid carried out this difficult request with aplomb, striking at Park Place, Irian, Nathan, and Borden before crossing back over into Steiner space 10 months after they had left. Though they utterly exhausted themselves in the effort, and few among them lived to see the Commonwealth again, the survivors became heroes at home for causing incalculable damage to the ill-prepared Freewells League. The Archon did not receive nearly as much praise from his senior flag officers, however. They found the whole operation reckless to the extreme, and were offended that they had not been included in its planning. In fact, the only person Alessandro had conferred with was a personal friend of his whom he had appointed to the Strategies and Tactics Division despite his complete lack of experience. Ultimately, the success of the deep raid meant their complaints fell on deaf ears. The Capellan Confederation armed forces were at their absolute nadir by 2985, the average readiness levels even dropping below the Second Succession War figures. Things had gotten so bad that many regiments could field only a single company of fully operational battle mechs. Against this backdrop, the Federated Sons aimed to land a knockout blow by once again taking aim at the industrious capital of the Tikonov commonality. While they redeployed the necessary units to that corner of the realm, the Avalon Hussars struck at Genoa before retreating to Fletcher. The CCAF had to combine the functional elements of 3 regiments in order to raise a large enough force to hit back at the Avalon Hussars later that year. The invasion of Tikonov began in February 2987, when the first of 6 waves of Federated Sons troops touched down on World. Almost the entirety of the Chesterton reserves were in garrison, but even then the AFFS was able to achieve a 3-to-1 numerical advantage, then 4-to-1 as successive task forces poured into the system. This made it the largest battle to ever take place on the Davion-Liao border. Despite the odds against them, the defenders utilized their lighter mechs to fight a highly mobile campaign, while the slower forces remained holed up inside the armoured bastions of Tikonov. Rather than send their limited reserves to the far Corward end of the realm, Liao took aim at the planet Aoja, a linchpin system that served as a major staging ground and supply hub at the center of the entire Capellan march. Elements of 7 different regiments descended on the former Confederation holding, and caused such widespread destruction that the planet was ultimately depopulated in later decades. Before they departed, the CCAF seized significant quantities of food, munitions, and a major gold stockpile. Other units conducted supporting raids at the 2 extreme ends of the border, further demonstrating how costly it was becoming for the AFFS to remain focused on just one system. Back at Tikonov, the arrival of the last of the Chesterton Voltigeurs in June spelled the end of the Davion's 4th attempt to take the planet. Their great victory for House Liao proved to be a turning point in their fortunes. When they came under attack again the following year, both the Federated Sons and Freewells League raiders found themselves outmatched by a rejuvenated Capellan Confederation. Early in 2987, Lyran archaeologists uncovered an old Star League library. The information housed within its databanks was too fragmented to be understood, but a team of researchers nonetheless took up the challenge, hoping to glean something from the corrupted data. What they didn't know was that every report they sent back to their university was being read by ROM agents embedded within the Commonwealth's institutions. They recognized that House Steiner was on the verge of a breakthrough that might reveal the secrets of hyperpulse generator technology, a discovery that threatened to collapse ComStar's monopoly on interstellar communications. The other successor states were making their own steps towards a technological recovery in the latter years of the 30th century. Such a turnaround flew in the face of the word of Blake's insistence that the great houses would destroy each other, clearing the path for the true believers within ComStar to step forwards as a leading light for humanity. It was their manifest destiny. Anything that threatened this had to be curtailed. Taking inspiration from the great Primus Raymond Karpov, Yin Takami ordered ROM to commence Operation Holy Shroud 2. The Order's current leader was a strong admirer of his distant predecessor, and would canonize Raymond Karpov as their fourth saint around this time. As they had done during the Second Succession War, ComStar sanctioned assassinations across the Inner Sphere, aimed at the leading scientific minds. Any research they had been undertaking would be destroyed. The success of this operation did not match that of its namesake. Though the Lyran Commonwealth team was tragically killed in a laboratory accident before they were able to realize the true value of their discovery, others were more fortunate. The ISF and MIIO in particular were able to uncover several of the plots against their scientists and prevent the hits from taking place. Unwilling to draw too much attention and risk ComStar's involvement coming to light, the Primus was forced to call a premature end to Holy Shroud 2. Yin Takami came under harsh criticism for the underwhelming results of this high-risk operation. He nonetheless stuck to his belief that ComStar needed to actively participate in the affairs of the Inner Sphere if they wanted to one day become its inheritors. To win back control of the Order, on June 14, 2988, the Primus proposed a radical restructuring of the First Circuit. At that time, it was composed of the heads of each Prime Circuit station, 10 in total. But Yin called for the creation of what he called advocate presenters. Each would serve as a political advisor for one of the great houses, allowing them to better exert their influence over the successor lords. The esteemed presenter Lyran would take on the responsibility for the Draconis Combine, with the other four posted to their respective capitals at Atreus, New Avalon, Cyan, and Tharkad. Despite their misgivings, the First Circuit saw the sense in Takami's proposal. With their approval, ComStar wormed its way into a position of ever greater power from which they could perpetuate the succession wars. The end of another chapter in the history of the Third Succession War takes us one step closer to present-day 3025. The next episode will cross the line between millennia as we hit the year 3000 and probably continue all the way up to 3014. The mid-30th century really was a troubled time for just about every successor state. They had some of their worst leaders all come around more or less at the same time. The Lyran Commonwealth was maybe so-so at this point. And in the Federated Sons, Andrew wasn't too bad, but he was trying to just clean up the mess that his predecessors had left him. But especially in the Capellan Confederation, Draconis Combine, and Freewells League, things were not going well. That situation is gonna completely reverse at the beginning of the next episode. I have ended it where I have now in 2988, because next time I want to cover the rise of every one of the 5 current, if you will, in 3025 at least, successor lords. So those are Maximilian Liao in 2990, Janos Marik in 2991, Takashi Kurita in 3004, Katrina Steiner in 3007, and then lastly Hansa Davion in 3014. Not to mention, of course, Primus Julian Tiapolo. We'll learn much more about them next time, but before I record that episode, I want to ask a quick question about pronunciation of all things. I do my absolute best to Google any words I'm unfamiliar with as I go through this series, and I'm always open to corrections on that account. But because this setting takes place in the distant future and is kind of detached from real-world countries on Earth, there are some where it's debatable what exactly is the correct way to say things. So certainly when I've ever discussed some of these characters, I've called them Hans Davion and Janos Marik, because that's just what seemed right at the time.
But somewhere along the line, I've learned that Janos is actually, I think, a Hungarian descended name, and because the Marik family is from Eastern Europe, I guess that would mean his actual name is Janos. Similarly, Hans Davion, I believe his name would actually be Hansa, but I very rarely ever see anyone else call him such. And that's not even getting into the question of Davion versus Davion. I always say Davion because my first introduction to the setting was through Mech Commander, and that's the way they say it in that video game. But there are certainly other games in the setting that say it Davion instead. I'm saying all this because I'm interested in getting your feedback on this. As it stands currently, I think I would like to try and relearn the way I'm saying some of these names, and go with Janos Marik and Hansa Davion. Also featured in the next episode is going to be the emergence of two of the most iconic mercenary units. It's quite surprising how recently they come into the setting from the perspective of 3025. I mean, some of these famous regiments like the Northland Highlanders or Iridani Lighthorse have been around for centuries by this point, but the Kellhounds and Wolf's Dragoons are much newer additions. Obviously, I don't want to spoil Wolf's Dragoon's origins at this point in our history. I am trying to present this series from the perspective of what somebody could conceivably know living in the Inner Sphere in 3025. I am aware that some of the details I go into with ComStar in particular probably break that rule, but I definitely want to stick to it as far as events in the Deep Periphery go. Anyway, that's all I want to talk about in this outro. I hope you have enjoyed the episode today. I'm sorry that it's taken me so long to get another one out. As most of you are no doubt aware, I've been playing MechWarrior 5 clans these last few weeks, but also there was the problem that I realized that this whole Third Succession War project is locked to my old PC, which I had moved and put away and didn't really want to go back to after setting up the new one. Transferring the whole thing across and keeping the file structure the same so all the pointers work to where all the individual files are stored on the PC is going to be a bit of a nightmare if I attempted it, which I'm not going to. So I'm going to have to come back to the old one every time I want to continue to work on the Third Succession War. I really would like to get it finished some point soon. I have 4 chapters still to go. I don't know if it's going to be possible to see it finished by the end of the year, but we'll try. Thank you everyone again for your support and for your patience with me for making this. If you enjoyed the video, you can give it a like. You can leave me a comment below if you've got any questions you want to ask. I'll try to respond to as many people as I can down there. Sharing the video around with others in the community who you think might enjoy it also greatly helps support the channel. And you can subscribe, of course, if you want to see more videos like this one. So for one final time, thank you again, and I hope to see you soon for another video.